Ah, space, the final frontier. A place humanity has dreamed for centuries of visiting, but the one place I'll never get to go. So why is it then, if I'm never gonna go to space, did the US government commit so heavily to creating a sixth branch of the military, breaking almost 75 years of military tradition, establishing the world's first fully independent military organization completely focused towards space warfare? Before we're able to discuss the formation of the Space Force, it's important to discuss the formation of the Air Force. The first untethered, manned hot air balloon flight was performed on November 26, 1783 in Paris, France. The first hot air balloon would not be flown in the Americas until after the Revolutionary War and was launched from the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia on January 9, 1793 by French aeronaut Jean-Pierre Blanchard. Hot air balloons would remain a hobby mostly associated with the rich and not associated with the military until the American Civil War, where the Union began the first American Air Corps, the Union Army Balloon Corps. The Corps lasted for nearly 2 years, from 1861 to 1863, and consisted of 8 aeronauts and 7 balloons. The balloons were used solely for reconnaissance in several major battles, such as Bull Run, Yorktown, Fair Oaks, and Vicksburg. There were also several schematics created to use the balloons to drop ordnance on enemy locations. However, they were little more than basic theories and never put into actual production. The possibility of using air assets during wartime was almost virtually dropped until 1903, when Wilbur and Orville Wright completed the first controlled, sustained flight of a powered, heavier-than-air aircraft. This prompted a massive wave of enthusiasm for flight, and a massive split occurred in military leadership, with some generals arguing that air power would be too experimental and too expensive, with others arguing that using airplanes would provide an obvious edge over their enemies. After a short period of debate, the reformists won, and the world's first dedicated heavier-than-air military unit was created, the Aeronautical Division Signal Corps. The Corps got to work immediately, with a notice for airplane models to be submitted for review. On December 23, 1907, only 4 years after the Orville brothers' first flight of only a couple hundred feet, the Corps mandated the following requirements for the world's first military airplane. That it be designed to be easily assembled and disassembled so that an army wagon could transport it. That it be able to carry 2 people with a combined weight of 350 pounds and sufficient fuel for a 125-mile flight. That it be able to reach a speed of at least 40 miles per hour in the air. That it demonstrate the ability to remain in the air at least 1 hour without landing, and that it land without causing any damage that would prevent it from immediately starting another flight. That it be able to ascend in any sort of country in which the Signal Corps might need it in field service, and be able to land without requiring a specially prepared spot. That it be able to land safely in case of accident to the propelling machinery, and that it be simple enough to permit someone to become proficient in its operation within a reasonable amount of time. By February 1, 1908, less than 6 weeks later, 41 prototypes were submitted to the Signal Corps in hopes to meet those qualifications. I want to pause for a second and emphasize on that level of progress. What that meant was that just 4 years after the Orville brothers' first flight, at least 41 different groups were able to build airplanes that they were confident enough could meet the military's expectation, and that was just within the US. In the end, the Orville brothers' design was chosen, and several planes were built. However, they were not able to be tested under live conditions until 1916 with the punitive expedition to capture Pancho Villa. The expedition was a response to Villa's attack on Columbus, New Mexico, and resulted in thousands of US troops being sent south. The expedition to capture Villa was a failure, and of the 8 planes sent, only 2 were left after 30 days, neither of which were able to fly, and they were shortly decommissioned after. But the true first test was during the First World War. By the time the US joined, the war had been raging for years, and air power had already been shown as vital. During the war, nearly 80,000 troops were members of the newly formed US Army Air Service, and they were able to maintain and fly over 700 planes, with over 17,000 troops dedicated to a balloon corps. The success of the First World War and the mass deployment of air power led to a reinvigoration of the debate on whether or not an independent air force was necessary or simply a fad, with major arguments against the creation being that of excessive costs, problems still facing a new technology, and that the creation of a separate branch would weaken the military and confuse the objectives of the US Army. Eventually, a compromise was settled, and the Army Air Corps was created. However, they were again reorganized shortly before the US entry into the Second World War as the Army Air Forces in order to better reflect their expanding role. The Second World War proved to everyone the vital nature of air power, and the need to create an independent branch was obvious. On September 18, 1947, the U.S. Air Force was formed as the fifth branch of the U.S. military, and the first branch to be created in over 150 years. While the issue of air superiority was decided, there was still the debate over who should have control of military assets in space. The Army managed to gather German and Nazi scientists, vital to the V-2 missile program, in order to create the Redstone rocket program, one of the earliest rocket attempts in the US military. The Navy was also attempting to establish a space program due to their early use of missiles during the end of the First World War. However, control of military space programs was assigned to the Air Force, as it was determined space is the natural progression of the sky. In 1954, the Air Force created its first space organization, the Western Development Division, under the leadership of General Bernard Schriever. Their main mission was to further the development of the ICBM program. However, between 1957 and 1992, they operated under 7 different names as their missions changed. Further, with the establishment of NASA, supported heavily by the Army's leading Redstone rocket scientists, including Wernher von Braun, the first director of NASA, space missions became further decentralized, with missions being assigned to whatever commands were able to maneuver politically to seize them. Over time, this led to confusion between commands as responsibilities began to overlap, prompting the creation of the Air Force Space Command, consolidating most military missions under a single umbrella. The main test of this new Space Command came during Operation Desert Storm, where space technology affected multiple areas of land operations, such as navigation, weather, communications, and satellite imagery, to the point that some people consider it to be the first space war. After the Gulf War, the Air Force was accused of artificially merging air and space operations and intentionally ignoring vital differences between air and space. The 2001 Space Commission, led by Donald Rumsfeld, criticized the Air Force for prioritizing aviation pilots over space officers in Air Force Space Command and Air Force promotions. Further, they prevented an independent space culture from growing and purposefully underfunded space initiatives to promote air initiatives instead. The Space Commission recommended the formation of a Space Corps under the Air Force between 2007 and 2011, with an independent Space Force being created shortly after, similar to how the Army Air Corps led to the Air Force. However, all of this progress was halted by the September 11th attacks, and the Space Commission was ended in 2002. Any conversation of the creation of a Space Force was ended until 2015, when 2 congressmen, Jim Cooper and Mike Rogers, began working together to introduce legislation to create the separate branch. I'll now be quoting a 2017 article in The Atlantic by Russell Berman, who discusses this in a little bit more detail. They blame the Air Force for lagging behind technologically, pointing out frustration that the United States remains heavily reliant on Russian-built rockets to launch into space. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have done more to give us extra launch capability than the Air Force has, Cooper said. This is stunning. Rogers and Cooper's chief complaint about the Air Force handling space are both bureaucratic and cultural. For years, they say, the Air Force has raided funds from Space Command to cover cost overruns of other projects, and it has failed to promote space leaders up the chain of command. The Air Force is dominated by a fighter-pilot culture, Cooper said, and it always has been. In an official statement of policy, the Trump administration said that the creation of a Space Force was premature, and that the Defense Department was still assessing the possibility as only one option of broader reorganization, and that the House proposition calls for an ambitious timeline, requiring the Pentagon to submit designs for the Space Corps by the beginning of 2019. This lack of faith would have likely led to the end of any further conversation of a separate military branch, were it not for an offhand comment made by former President Donald Trump. On March 13, 2018, when addressing Marines at Miramar Marine Corps Air Station in San Diego, the former president stated, "Space is a war-fighting domain, just like the land, air, and the sea. We may even have a Space Force. Develop another one, Space Force. We have the Air Force, we'll have the Space Force, we'll have the Army, the Navy, and I was saying the other day, because we're doing a tremendous amount of work in space, I said, maybe we need a new force. We'll call it the Space Force." And I was not really serious, and then I said, what a great idea. Maybe we'll have to do that. That could happen. That could be the big breaking story. These comments caused an immediate media backlash, prompting widespread ridicule, including a comedy Netflix series starring Steve Carell. However, this extensive media coverage did manage to force both Congress and the Pentagon to renew extensive talks regarding the creation of a new military branch that was being publicly backed by the president. Beyond that, on June 19, 2018, 3 months after the initial public comments, Trump ordered the Department of Defense to begin preparations to create the Space Force as an independent military branch. On February 19, 2019, Space Policy Directive 4 was signed, initially calling for the placement of the U.S. Space Force within the Department of the Air Force, later creating and transferring the service to the Department of the Space Force. Legislative provisions for the Space Force were included in the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, which was signed into law on the 20th of December, 2019. The Space Force was established as the 6th Armed Service Branch, with Air Force General John J. Raymond, the commander of the Air Force Space Command and U.S. Space Command, becoming the first Chief of Space Operations. As the Space Force is still a young organization, I believe it would be premature to discuss the progress they've made in the past 2 years. Many of the issues they've been presented with were either related to the bureaucracy that comes from separating from the Air Force, or through creating a new culture within their branch, such as establishing traditions, dress codes, and military standards. The first newly enlisted members of the Space Force graduated basic training just over a year ago. The Space Force also has 2 active astronauts within their ranks. However, their official capacity is not yet defined, even though the title Space Marine sounds really cool. The true roles, responsibilities, and capabilities of the Space Force have yet to be truly defined. As unlike with the Air Force, Space Force assets, although vital on the modern battlefield, are often used behind the scenes. Flying in airplanes has always been one of the main draws for the popularity of the Air Force, and the Air Force has learned to lean into that. Military air shows, flyovers at sports games, and even working with Hollywood to get military hardware into blockbuster releases. There's a very real understanding of who the Air Force is. Until the Space Force is able to similarly establish who they are, it's likely that they will continue to receive the backlash and comedic treatment they've received over the past couple years. There is one final thing I would like to address before ending this video: the Space Force seal. Many have pointed out that it looks incredibly similar to the Starfleet insignia, with George Takei, an actor from the original Star Trek series, implying it was simply copied. While I am not able to directly state how much, if any, inspiration was taken from Star Trek when creating the Space Force seal, I am also unable to definitively state where the inspiration was drawn for the Starfleet insignia. However, we are able to show that many of the elements of the Space Force seal are similar or identical to those within Air Force Space Command, with the element that caused the most controversy being the center arrow known as a delta. Without any context, it makes claims of plagiarism look very suspicious. After some research, we're able to identify the delta first being used in 1936 as the insignia for the 2nd Airlift Squadron, which is still in use today. We've also been able to identify dozens of insignias using deltas within the military, many of which began use prior to the design of the Starfleet insignia in 1964. At least one of these organizations were dedicated to space missions, namely unmanned rocket missions, and we're able to see another example that occurred during the Second World War. As for other aspects the two may share, I suggest checking out some of the links below, including a book of World War II insignias written in the 1960s. Also, if you're listening from the Space Force, please let me know where exactly the delta was used in 1961, because I just spent 5 hours researching to prove that this is a military tradition, but I have no idea what the claim on the Space Force website is referring to. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you managed to learn something new. Please be sure to like it and subscribe if you did, and I'll be sure to catch you next time. I'm the Pop Historian.